If you've played Resident Evil 4, its opening village fight will be etched in your mind to this day. After seeing Leon's police escort impaled and burned at the stake, a massive crowd of intelligent enemies descends upon you as you're trapped in the village center. You'll fight throughout the village, seek refuge on the rooftops, and be constantly on the move to evade certain death. Desperate for refuge, you may take Leon inside a house which he barricades himself in, only to feel certain dread when the enemies breach it from every direction and ready a chainsaw to tear through the front door, and then through you. The tension in this sequence is legendary, and it's fitting that immediately after it ends, with the village mysteriously ceasing their attacks in response to a church bell when all seems the most hopeless, that the title finally drops. This is one of the most confident title drops in gaming history, the game telling you, this is Resident Evil 4. This is the next level. Oh, and this is what happens if the Chainsaw Man does kill you. Yeah, damn. If you haven't played Resident Evil 4 and only just heard about what I said above, it may surprise you to learn that a few hours later you're having comic book banter over the radio with Cartoon Napoleon, running from giant statues, having comic book banter over the radio with the Hooded Claw, shooting a giant wooden drill that bursts out of a wall inside a castle, and backflipping through lasers. There were a couple other more overtly heart-pumping inclusions later in the game, but the tone overall felt a bit confusing and schizophrenic. The result of a game that was not just experimental and innovative, but also the ending of a long development process which was scrapped and restarted 4 times over. Incredible white-knuckle sequences early on, like the village scene, the Dynamite Valley, the fortress, the cabin siege, and the famous waterhall, give way to unremarkable shooting galleries and strange gimmicks later on in the campaign as the story gets sillier and sillier. Resident Evil 4's camp is something that fans look back on fondly. There's definitely some unforgettable lines in there, but it was something that was a bit polarizing at the time, just the same. It was a huge departure from both previous titles and from early previews, chiefly the hallucination build, sometimes referred to as Resident Evil 3.5. And while there's always something new to see in RE4, which is certainly part of its charm, it's also a bit disappointing that it feels uneven and that the tone of the game never quite matches the promise of the beginning. That tense village scene, the Chainsaw Man knocking at your door, the dread you felt as you realized the walls were closing in, and the relief you felt to barely make it through alive. The remake of RE4, featuring a darker and more serious atmosphere, harkens back closer to that prototype and to the more recent remakes. However, the new tone is only one factor in its design philosophy, and the thing that philosophy truly calls back to is that first iconic village center scene. It asks and answers, what if the entire game was all like this? The most obvious way the remake approaches it is, of course, the new atmosphere that I've touched on. Gone is the schizophrenic tone and campy cheese sprinkled amongst the horror fare. For the most part, anyway. The game is not at all above throwing in a one-liner, a cool moment, or some levity. But the game is consistently darker, more violent, and more serious. But not just for the sake of it, but rather because the atmosphere and the tone throws you deeper into its action situations, heightening the tension even further when you're afraid to see what's around the corner and desperately want whatever it is to stay away from you. The game will still take you through some of the late game set pieces which still lack much atmosphere, unfortunately, but the game overall places more emphasis on feeling consistent. A new look and feel, however, is far from the only trick up the game's sleeve. The original Resident Evil 4 had rather dumb enemies, who would often stand there and wait for you to kill them by design. The enemies also ran up to you before inexplicably stopping and choosing to amble the rest of the way over, as if waiting for you to shoot them to death. This was arguably a necessity due to the game's tank-style controls and the fact that you couldn't move and shoot at the same time, and the game is designed around those limitations as a result. But here, with a more modern control style, the game is free to employ truly aggressive enemies. The original game saw the player's go-to strategy as running a few steps away, turning around and shooting. The remake will have you running all over the map, dodging enemies who attack from multiple ranges and searching for better ground. The enemies still amble in a somewhat zombie-like fashion, but they're nonetheless smarter and more aggressive, and just taking a few steps back isn't going to cut it anymore. And rest assured, just like its charging Ganados, the remake does its best to bring the action to you. There's still sniping and loads of shooting, but you'll be uncomfortably close to the action this time, amping up the sense of danger and thrill, but also giving you the tools to compensate for it as well. Leon's knife is much more important this time around, being able to parry enemy attacks, finish them off on the ground with a button press, and if you fail to do so on certain enemies when the prompt appears, the enemy will come back even stronger, by the way. sneaking up for a stealth attack, and can be upgraded to make it more effective. But it can also break, requiring it to be repaired, meaning your close quarters abilities are a resource that needs to be monitored, just like your bullets and health items. These new abilities, along with the more modern control scheme, really transform the game. Rather than shooting down Ganados and taking Fitbit steps in between, it creates a true back and forth game with an ebb and flow to combat, where Leon needs to defend himself just as much as he needs to attack. He needs to react to enemy attacks and movements, and a set-piece area becomes a moving battlefield. The design of the game frequently highlights this too. Many areas simply have objectives to complete before you can leave, encouraging you to try to break through and get out, rather than killing everything in sight. The game also brings the action closer to you in a different way, if you're playing on the PlayStation 5. I have to really give them credit for how well the haptic feedback and the adaptive triggers are implemented in the game, and they serve to really heighten the immersion even further. When Leon is grappled and defends himself with a knife to the head, the resistance in that trigger almost feels like you yourself are the one stabbing through the bone and muscle of a Ganado's skull amidst a physical struggle. When the knife slices through a giant's parasite, you really feel the heaviness behind those slices to attack and pierce such a large enemy. Resistance when using a shotgun compared to a handgun makes you feel the power of that blast as it bursts a Ganado's head open. Certain combat sounds will even come from the controller's speaker, making you feel extra close to them. When you get trapped in a bear trap, you can feel the effort of Leon prying the thing open just in the feedback from the controller. Blocking a chainsaw makes the controller respond like it's trying to kill you as much as the chainsaw is trying to kill Leon. Even just walking around, you'll feel your feet touching the floor. You'll feel resistance when moving through waist-deep water. Resident Evil established itself with tanky controls, and it really suits the evolved tank controls to a T. This is the best I've seen the controller's features ever be implemented yet. Features like this can hardly make a game on its own, and sometimes come off as gimmicky. But when a developer really puts in the effort to implement them correctly, it makes the game just that much better. On the shooting front, like any modern gaming character, Leon can now move and shoot at the same time. Imagine that. However, moving while you're aiming comes with a risk, specifically the risk of not being able to hit the backside of a barn. After aiming for a moment, the crosshair will tighten, and after moving, it all goes to hell. Even a somewhat tight crosshair can backfire tremendously, such as when targeting a plug-headed Ganado. So there's no playing it safe from a distance. The Ganados are much faster and more aggressive, and not stopping to aim can cause you to miss them entirely, resulting in an axe to the head. Thus, the game's action inherently moves closer to you, amping up the tension because a Ganado in your face isn't as simple as taking a few steps back and then safely shooting him from afar. Unless you use a handgun which can be equipped with a laser sight, bringing back the OG feel of always hitting whatever you aim at, no questions about it. But even that comes with a downside, because the handguns with that attachment are weaker in power and will have more trouble stopping a charging Ganado. There's another aspect outside of combat that the game uses to keep you in the game rather than out of it. That is in its pacing and its treatment of cutscenes. In the original game, encounters just sort of happened and kept happening in a nonsensical rhythm. In Remake, they're much more structured, with each chapter consisting of a few notable action events, each broken up effectively by a little bit of exploration or one or two lighter encounters. Many of the original game's more filler moments, random hallways with 3 goons, have been cut or heavily reworked, so that nearly every encounter feels novel, exciting, and significant. The result is a game that's really a journey full of set pieces and carefully designed challenges to overcome. The cutscenes themselves are notably shorter in length, and there's an effort to make what used to be cutscenes happen as in-game events instead. For example, a cutscene immediately plays at the end of the village scene in the original. In the remake, the villagers will stop in their tracks in-game, and there's a brief moment of peace for the player before the cutscene takes over for Leon's famous line. Rather than the scene being interrupted by a cutscene, the combat actually ends right in front of you. A subtle but impactful difference when you're sucked into the struggle to survive. For a more significant example of this, Krauser's knife fight went from a cutscene to an entire unique boss battle where you need to knife fight him yourself. Back to straight up cutscenes, many of them are tweaked to be over more quickly. Let's compare the unleashing of the El Gigante here. In the original game, this takes over a minute, but the remake changes the scene so you're in the fight within 30 seconds. There are small changes like this in many cutscenes to keep the game flowing and to make them feel more connected to gameplay rather than stopping and starting frequently. Speaking of stopping and starting frequently, the comms system has been changed. The original game utilized a system where Leon would stop, pick up his radio in a cutscene, a chat inspired by Metal Gear's codec calls would ensue, and then he resumed the game once it was done. In the remake, these scenes all occur in-game. Though you can't do much but amble around or play around with the camera during these chats, it nonetheless keeps you inside the game instead of pausing it completely for a cutscene, followed by another pause for a brief text scene. These chats are also much rarer than before, with most of them being cut. And while fans will definitely lament some of these exclusions, they do keep the game moving much more swiftly. Personally, I love games with long cutscenes. After a tough section of gameplay, it's nice to be able to put down the controller, take a break, and listen to the story for a while before getting back to it, and that cycling can definitely be an intentional part of the gameplay loop. But it's also very frustrating when a game seems to constantly stop you, killing the momentum. And I have to say, all of these changes in Resident Evil 4 Remake adds up to a game that's just hard to put down. I often find myself sitting down to play a chapter, and once the chapter ends I'll think, maybe one more, and then I've played 4 of them. The game succeeds at having incredible forward momentum through these changes in the pacing. The remake of Resident Evil 4 wasn't a game I was especially looking forward to. I'd already played several versions of the original game all to death, and didn't expect a new coat of paint to be enough to give it new life for me. Cue my surprise when the game delivered the same thrill and suspense I felt way back in 2005. And cue my surprise again when it didn't ever let up. Between the changes in story, pacing, gameplay, and tone, the game truly adds up to a package that delivers on the promise made in the original's most iconic scene, and continues to do it all the way through. When you play either version of Resident Evil 4, you know it's springtime for gaming.